Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Gia. I'm a 25-year-old lady who lives in my mom's basement, and today is the November wrap-up. So in November, I read 5 books, but I did DNF a 6th book, so I read about half of what I read in the month of October. I'll be honest, November had about a 2-week reading slump for me in which I didn't get a lot done. It was largely because I was biting off more than I could chew, and I was reading 3 really dense fantasy reads at the exact same time. That it wasn't that they weren't good, it's just that reading them all together was not my best choice. I ended up finishing one of those. One of them I got about 13% of the way through, and the other I didn't even start, so I just let it get returned, and I will take it out at a different time. So starting out strong with, I technically talked about this at the end of October, but I technically finished Shadowkiss November 1st. So it is part of the November wrap-up. I finished it at the end of October, November 1st time. So it does technically count as a November read because that's when I finished it. But again, this book slapped. I gave it 5 stars. It was a much better book than Frostbite. It had a lot of tense moments and a lot of action and climaxing of the first arc of the story, ending with, spoilers, Dimitri being turned Strigoi against his will, and now Rose has withdrawn from St. Vladimir's Academy on her 18th birthday, setting out to go kill him because they always promised each other that they would do so if that happened to the two of them. So again, as far as it being a 6-book series go, it's a really long series and the books do get lengthy, but the 3rd book being the longest in the series, it didn't feel that long. I still like whizzed through it, and it didn't feel like any part of it was unnecessary. So I find a lot with a lot of bigger books that some parts could have been cut out. I really didn't feel like that with this book. So going back to the Vampire Academy series as part of my Revisiting YA series, I honestly feel like every bit of the book mattered, and I think that that's a really important thing to have when you have these longer reads, that it doesn't feel like such a drag, and there's no point in the book where you're just like, okay, does any of this like matter to the overall story? Like, could we have skipped this? Or you find yourself like wanting to get to the next chapter to see what happens next. So I honestly think that this book was well constructed and well done, and revisiting it from an adult perspective, I still think it slaps. I gave it 5 stars. And when I mean 5 stars, I don't mean that it's perfect. I mean that it's 5 stars for what it is. So the way that I judge books on a 1 to 5 star scale is more based on comparative to its genre, as far as, you know, YA reads go versus adult fantasy versus, you know, contemporary versus romance. They're not compared to each other. They're compared to others in its genre. I may be bipolar, but I have not gotten to the point where I have become manic enough to have separate spreadsheets separated by genre, just because I think that actually separating every book by genre would be extremely complicated because there are so many books that have crossovers, and what would you consider romance or what would you consider sci-fi, like majority romance or majority sci-fi or majority fantasy, like what categories do they fall into? It gets complicated really, really quickly. So when you're trying to divide them up and compare them to each other actually in separate spreadsheets, it just gets really complicated. So again, as far as it being a 5-star read, I consider it a 5-star read for it being a YA fantasy, YA romance, paranormal romance series. That being said, the second book that I read was The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson, a very different read. I've read this on audiobook, so I listened to it. This is a contemporary Carrie retelling centered around a biracial teenager who is outed by her racist classmates, and there is a viral video of her that goes around town. And at the end of it, the solution that the student council attempts to rectify everything that is going on is that they try to have an integrated prom, because this story is taking place in 2014 in Georgia, in a rural part of Georgia, that they have segregated proms, and this is seen as normal. This is seen as a tradition to keep up, and you know, that's the way that they like it, which is so infuriating. But the conclusion that they all come to is to come together after, you know, national news gets met about this situation that happens to Maddie, the main character, is to have an integrated prom, and people have positive and negative feelings about it. So the other thing that what made this book so interesting to me is that you're not only getting this book from a multiple perspective of multiple students that are involved in the circle, not just Maddie, but then other people that are involved in the community, like Jules and Kenny and everybody else that is involved in the narrative. You start out every chapter with a podcast episode called Maddie Did It, and it is taking place in the present time with the hosts trying to dissect the whole situation from a true crime perspective, because what we know is that there was a horrible, tragic accident in this town where hundreds of people die and the town gets burnt to the ground, and the only survivors that come forward all agree that Maddie Washington was responsible for this tragedy, and they don't know why. Their whole thing is trying to unravel this mystery as to what happened in this town, what Maddie Washington is, and discussing like whether or not she had supernatural powers or not, because as we all know, Carrie did have supernatural powers. So I found this book incredibly profound. I have not read Carrie. I have not read the original work by Stephen King, but my mom is an original Stephen King stan, so it is honestly like a crime for me to not know at least the story if I haven't read it. So this was my first experience with the story itself, like actually reading it, because it is pretty close as a retelling. However, the timeline and the main messages that you're getting from it are very different. You're focused on this teenager who is nervous and an introvert and outed, and she didn't even want to go to public school, but she was forced to because the government didn't even know that she existed. She was forced into society and then also had to force herself to conform to this white identity because it was drilled into her that people couldn't find out that she was half black. You feel really sorry for her. Maddie goes through a lot. She has a lot of fear and anxiety, and I was scared for her that she was living in an abusive home. Her father was terrible to her. But I think what made this book so profound to me is that everything that everybody said, because you had every type of character in this series. You had the mean racist girl who did everything out of spite and brought everything up to 10 to 11 because she thought that she could get away with it because of daddy's money, who was Jules. You had the white girl who was trying to help, but it turned out that she was just trying to do everything for herself and what it could do for her, that she was trying to help other people, which was Wendy. Her intentions were selfish. You had the black man who was leaning into the positive stereotypes that people thought of him because it elevated him to this like faux acceptance in society, which was Kenny. And then his sister, who is a black woman who is outspoken and doesn't want to conform to society, but people rag on her more because she's a woman. So you have these discussions of racism, colorism, and sexism. It was so infuriating to read from the perspectives and listen from the perspectives of these people. They all had different voice actors, by the way. It was amazing recording. But to listen to the thoughts of these people from all different perspectives of society, and everything that they said is something that I have heard before from the mouth of somebody else, like in real life. And of course, everything was in a vacuum. It was inside this book, but like to have everything kind of compiled into that book was so maddening and frustrating and terrifying to read it. And I felt so upset and infuriated because I've, heard these things before, and it made me like want to fight against it even harder. It was powerful. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it. I honestly think that this needs to be in classrooms. This needs to be put in high school classrooms. It reminded me, despite the retelling aspect of it, it reminded me of The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I had to read it when I was in high school, and I think that this needs to be something that kids need to be exposed to. This is something that kids need to be reading because they need to hear these things that are being said and know that they're wrong from a young age. This book is probably the most important I've had all year. 5 stars. 5 stars. S tier. The next book I finished was The Sunbearer Trials by Aiden Thomas. I really, really liked this book. I gave it 4 stars. This story is about Teo, who is a son of Quetzal. This universe is inspired by Mesoamerican mythologies and legends. So I have a little bit of a background knowledge through my archaeological and anthropology background. So I knew a little bit about the gods and who they were and what that meant. This book is said to be inspired by Mexican mythology, but Quetzal or Quetzalcoatl is a Aztec god. So I thought that maybe this was inspired by more Aztec gods going into it. The more that I read into it, the more that I saw that it was truly an inspiration of, I would say it's more of like a Mesoamerican inspiration. So you have like a million gods. There's like a god for everything. So Quetzal, who Teo is the son of, is the god of birds, and then his best friend Naya is the daughter of Tierra, or the god of earth. And then they have another friend, Zio, who is the son of the god of bad luck, who I don't remember what his name is. But all of the direct translations of most of the gods can be translated from Spanish to English as to what they are. Honest to God, tested my knowledge of the Spanish language. I took 4 years of Spanish in high school, which is more than the normal 2 years. So I could read and write it pretty well by the end of high school, but it's one of those you use it or lose it kind of things. So it really tested me as far as my knowledge went. I had to definitely Google search a couple of things. As far as the plot of the story, you have the separation of the gods into different categories. So you had the golds, the jades, and the obsidians. And the obsidians are these evil gods. One of them was named Chupacabra, that were cast upon the stars and they're locked in the sky. The Sun Bearer trials they are a once in a decade competition where Sol or Sun chooses 10 semidios or demigods to participate in this competition where 10 demigods compete, and the one who loses is sacrificed by the one who wins. And then the power that the sacrificee lets out is funneled to all the different soul temples across the land, to all the temples. This power blazes for a decade, and it keeps the obsidian gods in the sky. So this is a very important cultural event in which one person ends up getting sacrificed for the good of all people. So traditionally, the golds, who are considered like the more elite gods, they tend to be I always think of them like districts 1 through 3 in the Hunger Games. The gold semidios are like the sons and daughters of water and earth gods, like foundations of the earth. But Teo is the son of a jade god, and the jade gods are like basically everybody else. They're like the Hufflepuffs of society. So when all of them, by obligation have to go to this claiming ceremony and Sol chooses Teo, he is very confused because the only semidios that have been chosen in the last several trials have been golds. And he finds out later that the last jade that participated in a Sunbearer Trials competition was actually a daughter of Quetzal, and she ended up getting sacrificed. So that was the last jade to compete in living memory, and she died. So Teo is notably very concerned about this. The trials themselves are more like miniature games where they can't hurt each other or do anything, but it's like they have to race or they have to find hidden objects, or there's a riddle. So there's different aspects that they have to do. And then for the different trials, they travel around to different cities, and the trials are hosted by different gods. So it's like a tour of some sort. So I found the story quite endearing. I think that in particular, having a trans lead is very important, but it wasn't just that he was there. It wasn't just that Teo was there and he was trans. There was another trans character who was coming to terms with their transness, and there were a lot of important conversations that were taking place in this narrative, where not just that trans, non-binary, gay, bi people exist, but they're having internal struggles and conversations with themselves and others about what it's like to accept yourself and live in this world. So this world is also extremely accepting. There are a few gods who have like 2 dads or 2 moms, like Naya has 2 dads, and this is considered normal. Like basically everybody's considered non-binary at birth, and then they have a gender confirming ceremony when they're like 15 or so. So that was something that Teo talked about how you don't have to choose what gender you are or neither until you hit a certain point. So I thought that was quite progressive and quite cool that it was basically unspoken, which is something that I've been wanting in media for some time. It's just that not just, oh, there is a big plot arc that somebody is gay. It's just they're gay, moving on. So I liked the fact that this universe was constructed at its core to be like that. So there are a lot of important conversations between Teo and Zio, because Zio is trans and coming to terms with being trans, and then the process of transitioning, whereas Teo has been transitioned for 2 years at this point. So there are questions and conversations where Zio is asking Teo questions about what it's like, what was the process, how did he know? And I thought that this was so good to have in a book where other teenagers can read it. And I'm not the direct audience, I'm not the targeted audience for this book. I'm a 25-year-old woman who lives in my mom's basement. This book is targeted towards the 12 to 19 or 12 to 18 age group, I'd say at the broadest range. I understand I am not the target demographic for this, but I think that this is an important narrative to put in here, that people are going to have questions about their identity. To have those conversations reflected in media in a positive way, I think is so important to have. That being said, as a 25-year-old woman, I did tire of teenage antics, and I did get kind of tired of how catty their behavior was, and the dialogue between them felt really stilted and like AI generated, just a touch. Like if maybe I'm just an old woman and a geriatric crone, but it didn't hit for me. The dialogue sometimes veered on too juvenile, even for like a bunch of teenagers. Motivations were a bit juvenile, and they didn't feel real. So I was about to rate the book like 3.5 stars because of that, and the pacing. I didn't know where the book was going, but then at the very end, there was a huge twist that like re-engaged me. Like I want the sequel right now. So I think that towards the end, it really comes to a great cliffhanger. And I think that the next book is going to be even better. So I'm excited, and I will be picking up the second book. The next book was a DNF. It was The Savior's Sister. Oh God, this book, I barely made it a third of the way through this book. I had so many problems with this book that they're innumerable at this point. So I read the first book back in February, and it was like it's the first book on this spreadsheet. Like, it was the first book that I had read in a really long time for fun. So I read it and I was like, oh, that was really good, like 4 or 5 stars. And then I moved on and didn't touch the author for quite some time. But then I pick up The Savior's Sister, almost a full year later, and I'm like, what is this garbage? So I've talked about The Savior's Champion before. It is a Hunger Games-esque in Greek/Roman society, in which there is a savior or religious symbol that is the queen or the monarch of this society, and every time a savior comes of age, there is a tournament, and a bunch of dudes compete for her love and kill each other off, and whoever wins becomes her husband. So this savior is named Leela, and her mother was murdered, so she has lived her entire life locked up in the castle and has not left, so nobody knows what she looks like. And her father is the worst and is planning to kill her. So she finds out that in the tournament, 3 men have been positioned to kill her. So at the end of The Savior's Champion, our protagonist Tobias is getting to the end of this tournament and they're trying to figure out like who is the person behind this, because when Tobias first meets Leela, she is just a healer girl, and come to find out later on that she is the real savior. There is the, prince in hiding trope, if you will, and I found the first book compelling from the perspective of Tobias, even if it was a bit crude, and Jenna seems to want to, I saw this put this way, the normalization of vulgarity is something that Jenna seems to be very passionate about, that I don't need to hear about genitalia every other sentence. Like everything seemed to be about dick and balls. Everything. If I heard the word cock one more time, I was going to scream. There was that I found problematic. There was a very prominent barrier gaze. There was very prominent bisexual violent villain. There was the hypersexualization of the lesbian best friend. The way that LGBTQ characters were handled in this is extremely poor. So you see it, I see it more now because I already know about it. So when I read it the first time, I was like, this is weird and problematic. But then when I saw it the second time, it was somehow worse. So in the competition, there were two combatants who, it was like that moment with an international bachelorette or bachelor episode where two of the girls announced that they wanted to leave the competition because they fell in love with each other. It was like that, except it was two of the guys, and one of them ended up dying and then the other was set free. And I didn't like that for two reasons. They didn't have to do that. You could have just found out that they were gay and set them free, because there was a rule that the savior could set somebody free out of their, own volition, and because they asked to be set free. There could have been a point to make an exception to set them both free, and I would have liked that. There was very clear exoticizing of the other gay character because he was sent to the country as a emissary from a foreign country. He was sent there by his own queen to be presented as a marriage match for an advantageous relationship with the other country. He spoke with an accent. He was racially coded. I didn't like it. It was showing that his homosexuality was like an exotic thing. And I didn't like that in particular. So that was the two things I didn't like: the barrier gaze and the exoticization of the other gay person. So the violent bisexual villain, the most prominent villain in this story is Kaleo, and he is the worst, but what probably makes him the worst in general is the fact that he wants to K-word you and then R-word you, whether you're a man or a woman. And he says it to both Leela and Tobias multiple times about how he wants to do that, and I don't like that. I think that bisexual men in general don't receive enough positive representation in media. I think that bisexual men are shown as a closet gay, essentially. So I don't like it. I do not like this. Like, stop representing bisexual men as violent. I don't like it. Also, sexual conquest and violence should not be a part of your villainy. It just, it frustrated me. And then the lesbian best friend was also shown as like the one that taught Leela about sex. So she was constantly talking to Leela about, are you daydreaming about any man in particular and what you want him to do to you? And it's like, why, as a lesbian, are you so concerned about whether or not Leela's thinking about dick? I was just astounded that was all she seemed to talk about. It was Delphi. I was astounded that was all Delphi seemed to talk about. And as a gay woman of color in this series, I think she was so underutilized as a character that it was just all it focused on was the fact that she was gay and then fucked all the other handmaidens and then taught Leela about sex. So I was extremely frustrated. I can understand that authors want to make it more normalized for like new adult fantasy and even YA fantasy to talk about sex and sexuality and everything. But like, bad representations also exist, and that needs to be acknowledged as well. Like, not all representation is good representation. When something is underutilized or underrepresented, there can also be bad representations of it, and that needs to be pointed out. Hello, editing Gia at 2:15 in the morning to tell you that I forgot about one of the things that made me so irritated about the Savior Sister. I had several issues with the character of Pippa because we met her in the Savior's Champion, and I could see it then, but it is even clearer in the Savior Sister that Pippa is coded to be an autistic character. Also, Jenna herself has
just said it. Pippa is seen as being boy obsessed and childish, and she is noted for acting younger than her years, and she is babied, treats her like a literal infant, and drags her around like a 5-year-old, calling her little duckling and talking around her and not to her. Also, she is essentially a hostage. Leela finds out that her father is trying to kill her or wants to kill her at a really young age, which doesn't make any sense. But like, she finds out when she was like maybe 6 or 7 that not only her father had her mother killed, but that her father wants to kill her. And then by the time she's 20, when the tournament starts, is when this whole plan gets put into place. Like, things have been happening before then. By the time she gets to 20 is when all of this stuff starts really going down. So she lived like over a decade and almost a decade and a half with this secret that she was basically holding Pippa against her will, because Pippa is the granddaughter of one of her father's senators in his little group of cronies. So Leela is essentially controlling the grandfather, who is a part of the council, by saying that she will hurt Pippa if he betrays her or doesn't basically spy for her. I don't like that, the use of an autistic character being used as bait and is being threatened her entire life. And Leela has to this point never come forward about it or confronted it or felt any guilt about it. In general, I think that Pippa is very poorly written. And I have a lot of issues with the fact that autistic characters are either written like The Good Doctor or Sheldon Cooper or like Pippa. It's one or the other. There is a spectrum, and there's a reason why there's a spectrum. So I really cannot stand the way that this character is infantilized, despite the fact that she is a sentient person with feelings and she should be treated as such. And they are not providing her with the resources to succeed, but also they are using her as a literal object. So, yeah, fuck this interpretation of autism. I hate it. For those reasons, I got to a third of the way through this book, and it was a slog. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I cannot read this book anymore. Getting over that, let's get into some actual good books. The next book I read was over Thanksgiving break, and it was For Dead Queens by Astrid Schulte. This is actually the Owl Box exclusive. The normal copy of this book is where it is red, it is blue, and it's also signed. Yay me. I did not realize that I had a signed copy when I picked this up again. I got this pre-owned several years ago when I was trying to branch out into more books again. I also got this cute little insert with all the faces of the queens. I really, really liked this book. It surprised me in multiple ways. I will be doing a video on it itself, so just to talk about it in general, you know from the start that all the 4 queens are gonna die. So from the very beginning of this book, we meet our protagonist named Carolee. She is 17 years old, and she is a dipper. So she is a like a street rat who makes her life by stealing from people, and she is in the employ of somebody who runs a black market auction house, who then sells the things that she steals to the highest bidder, and then she gets a cut of that. She left her family some time ago. They have a merchant slash fishing business, and she did not want to be in that business. She tried to convince her parents that turning to a life of stealing from people and to a life of crime would be better for them in the long run, that they could, you know, leave the place where they are or move to a better social standing. Their parents wanted to keep an honest living. That you find out that on purpose, Carolee crashed her parents' boat, and it caused her father to have a terrible health accident, and he is now fighting for his life. So she has left her family and gone full force into this industry of crime, trying to earn enough money to get by, and she feels too ashamed to go back to her family. She is sent out on a job to steal from somebody in particular, and turns out she uncovers a government conspiracy. This country is called Quadara. It is separated into 4 quadrants: Archia, Ionia, Toria, and Ludia. Those are the names, and they all have different things that they focus on. So Ludia is like arts and entertainment, Ionia is science and technology, Archia is like farming and agriculture industry, and then Toria is like a balance of them all. Many moons ago, there was a king who decided he was going to take multiple wives, and so he took a wife from every quadrant of Quadera, and then when he died,
the four wives ultimately agreed that they would rule together as a group of four. So ever since then, there have been four queens of Quadera representing each quadrant accordingly. There are certain laws that say only a daughter can ascend after them. It doesn't matter who they have the baby with. That doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter who they marry, man or woman. None of that matters. All that matters is that they have a daughter who ascends them, and the daughter that they do have is sent to live in their quadrant of home and lives their life as an adopted individual until their mother dies, and then they are brought to the kingdom to learn how to be queen. So we have our four queens. We have Marguerite, Iris, Stessa, and Cora. This book is this dystopian mystery race against time as Carolee uncovers a government conspiracy and she is trying to stop it from happening. So I really, really liked this book. I think that it does a lot of trope subversion. I'll go into that more into its own individual review. I don't think that it is without fault. That is why it is a 4-star read. This is a standalone book and it's like 415 pages. I think it's incredibly well constructed. I think that the world building is like 75% of the way there. I think that it could have been done like a teensy bit more, but I think that we have enough background in the book to understand like what's going on in the greater plot. But if Astrid ever chooses to write a second book, we could get more of that. But I also understand that this book could have been like 100 pages longer easily if she wanted it to be. So I think for a 400-page book, I think that this is quite well done. And it earned a very swift 4 stars from me. And the last book that I read this month was Realmbreaker by Victoria Aveyard. This book took me over a month to read because it was very dense. This is the only book that I finished as a part of when I was in the reading slump and I was reading 3 fantasy reads at the exact same time. This was the one that I finished. I found it extremely compelling, but I think that the world building was very vague. And it was, the characters I think need a bit more background. This is once again a multi-perspective story. It is a fantasy surrounding multiple characters that come together in this ragtag group of misfits. So in the very beginning of the story, you start out with Andrew and he witnesses the rise of an undead army that kills everybody, like including the knight that he squires for. Dom was also there, but he didn't know that until later. So the army killed everybody, and Andrew is the only person who survives other than Dom. So Andrew goes back to his queen and Dom goes back to his queen, and they report what they saw, and they get very disappointing results where Dom's queen doesn't want to do anything about it because she thinks that they're all doomed. Andrew's queen doesn't want to do anything about it because she is only 19. She's only been queen for 4 years and everybody still thinks that she is too green to do anything. She also has to live up to this huge legacy that her father left behind. So she is like wanting the glitz and the glory of the old empires, but at the same time, she doesn't want to be too rash and make any bad decisions. So she just chooses to stay completely neutral. The undead army came from a spindle, which is a tear in the dimension, essentially. And this dimension opens up to other dimensions and monsters can come out. It's reminded me a little bit of like in The Witcher season 2 when that happened. So the way that you can open and close a spindle is with spindle blood and with a spindle blade. So spindle blood is the blood of the old empire, old lineage. Very, very rare to have descendants of that blood, but they have magic in them. So that mixed with the spindle blade, which is also like a semi-magical sword that they can wield, that they have to do together to open and or close this tear in the dimension. So this undead army comes out of nowhere, out of this tear in the dimension. The person who is responsible for all of this undead army nonsense is actually someone who has the power to open and close it in general. So he is the twin brother of another spindle-blooded person who was raised in basically as a prince. He was raised in the courts and he was raised to be like a representation of the old empire and he was meant for greatness, whereas his twin brother was cast aside and raised on the streets and adopted. I don't exactly remember why, but they separated the twins at birth, and the twin brother is stilted and angry, and now he wants to take over basically. So he wants to tear open the spindle and give all of this world and this power to what is known as What Waits, which is a, I guess, bad old god. It's a big bad. So he wants to give it to this individual called What Waits. So after the stilting of these two queens, Dom goes on his way to find somebody who might know someone who can close the spindle. So he finds a assassin named Sorasa, who finds a spindle-blooded child named Coraine, who is the niece of Terrastan. Her father was the other twin. And then they get together with Andri, who somehow had the sword, and then they have to go and figure out how to close the tear in the dimension. I think that there was a lot of potential for this story, and the second book actually recently came out. It was actually the second book that got me to the first one in the first place, because I didn't realize that Blade Breaker was a sequel, so I checked it out first. I think that the world building is good, but a little vague. I think that there's a lot of discussion about like countries and geography and politics and how it all mixes together. But I do think that there is more that could be learned. I think the backgrounds of some of the characters is a bit weak. Sarasa in particular, I think she was quite underutilized. And anytime there was any discussion about her past or references to her past, it would always go to like this offshoot response of, oh, I haven't thought about that in a long time, or that's a story for another day. And it's like, no, I want to know. So I wonder if Blade Breaker goes more into depth about these characters. I think that Coraine was a pretty compelling character. She is this 17-year-old girl whose mother is a pirate captain, and her mom doesn't want her daughter to be like her. So although she has been raised on the seas, now Coraine wants to go on her own and do her own thing. And her mother doesn't want her to. Her mother just wants her to, she can go with them when they stay local, but anytime her mom is going to go pillage far away, she makes Coraine stay at home. And I feel for her. I feel bad for her, but I also understand from a mother's perspective why she wouldn't want her kid to be involved in that. But Coraine has this deep need to go out on her own and be her own person. She seems oddly motivated to get out there and become her own self and carve her own path. And this is all chalked up to her having the core blood in her veins. The empire of old core is what is inside her, and this is what makes her ambitious and motivated and stuff. I get it. In the end, I rated this book 3.5 to 4 stars. This book was almost 600 pages long. I wanted to like it more. It's just I feel like it's so sad to say that in an almost 600-page book, I wish that there was more that was said, but about certain things. And we could have touched on people's background. This was a very plot-driven story, so I'm wondering if maybe I could have had a little bit more character development and character focus if other parts were carved out. Anyway, those are all the books that I read in the month of November. In the month of December, I want to read 8 to 9 books. I have a list. I have Night of the Raven, Dawn of the Dove, A Court of Wings and Ruin, Blood Promise, Spirit Bound, Last Sacrifice, Monsters Born and Made, The Hawthorne Legacy, Sisters of the Winter Wood, and The Gathering Dark, an anthology of folk horror, which I just picked up at the library because it was on hold. I'm really hoping that December is a bit more fruitful for me. I had to open my work availability because I need to work more. Plus, I am getting over a cold. Sorry, I am so congested right now. Had to open my work availability through the holiday season because I need the money. I just got my car back and it cost almost $1,600 to fix it. So with all that being said, remember to give a like and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like to find me anywhere else, you can find me on Twitch, Twitter, and Instagram at Huntress Gia. Remember to drink water and be nice to each other and exude kindness and empathy with everything that you do. In the future, I will be streaming more on Twitch. You could catch me there, but my schedule is unstable and inconsistent, so check out my Twitter. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.